In the spring of 1908, the residents of Porte, Indiana, believed they knew their neighbor Belle Gunness. A hard-working widow with 3 children, she ran a 48-acre pig farm on the outskirts of town, a woman who'd survived tragedy after tragedy, yet somehow persevered. But beneath the floorboards of her farmhouse, beneath the soil of her property, beneath the carefully constructed facade of respectability, lay a truth so monstrous it would shock the entire nation. Belle Gunness wasn't just a survivor. She was a predator. And her farm wasn't a homestead. It was a graveyard. The story begins not with violence, but with promise. Belle Polsdatter Storsett arrived in America from Selbu, Norway, in 1881, joining the great wave of Scandinavian immigrants seeking fortune in the New World. She was tall, nearly 6 feet, and powerfully built, with piercing blue eyes and a determined set to her jaw. America, she believed, would give her what Norway could not: wealth, independence, and control over her own destiny. She settled in Chicago, working as a domestic servant while learning English and studying the rhythms of American life. She was patient, she was calculating, and she was watching. In 1884, Belle married Mad Sorensen, a fellow Norwegian immigrant who worked as a night watchman. They opened a confectionery shop on Grand Avenue, a modest business that should have provided a comfortable living. But comfort was never Belle's ambition. When the shop mysteriously burned to the ground in 1898, Belle collected the insurance money without a trace of sorrow. Fire, it seemed, was her friend. The couple used the insurance payout to purchase a new home in the Chicago suburbs, a home that would also burn, yielding another insurance settlement. A pattern was emerging, though no one was looking closely enough to see it. Belle and Mads had 4 children together, though 2 died in infancy under circumstances doctors found troubling, but never quite suspicious enough to investigate. The symptoms, convulsions, acute gastric distress, could have been natural, or they could have been something far more sinister. On July 30th, 1900, the same day 2 life insurance policies on Mads overlapped, providing maximum payout, he died suddenly. The doctor diagnosed it as an enlarged heart. Belle diagnosed it as opportunity. She collected nearly $9,000, a fortune in 1900, and her freedom. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to The Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. Within a year, Belle had reinvented herself. She moved to Porte, Indiana, purchasing a substantial farm property with her insurance windfall. The farmhouse was isolated, surrounded by acres of fields and woods, far enough from town to ensure privacy. She needed that privacy. In April 1902, she married Peter Gunness, a local widower with 2 daughters. Peter brought his own modest savings to the marriage, and for a brief moment, it seemed Belle might settle into conventional domestic life. But conventional was never in Belle's nature. Less than 9 months after the wedding, Peter Gunness was dead. Belle's story was simple, delivered with tears and trembling hands. A heavy sausage grinder had fallen from high shelf, striking Peter in the head and killing him instantly. Her stepdaughter Jenny claimed to have witnessed something different, a deliberate act, not an accident. But who would believe a child over a grieving widow? The coroner ruled it accidental death. Belle collected another $3,000 in insurance money. The farm was now entirely hers, along with Peter's 2 daughters and her own remaining children from her first marriage. The newly widowed Mrs. Gunness threw herself into farm work with unsettling enthusiasm. She expanded the pig operation, planted crops, and hired a steady stream of handymen to help with the heavy labor. She was a woman alone, she explained to her neighbors, doing her best to maintain the property and provide for her children. The community admired her resilience. They had no idea they were watching a serial killer refine her methods. By 1905, Belle had discovered a more lucrative enterprise than insurance fraud. She began placing personal advertisements in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest, targeting the loneliest demographic in America: middle-aged immigrant men seeking companionship. Her ads were masterpieces of manipulation. Comely widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in Porte County, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided, with view of joining fortunes. No replies by letter considered unless sender is willing to follow answer with personal visit. The key phrase was equally well provided. She wanted men with money, men willing to prove their financial worth. The responses poured in. Lonely Norwegian bachelors and widowers from Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota, and beyond read her words and imagined a future, a prosperous farm, a capable wife, a ready-made family. Belle requested that serious suitors bring cash to demonstrate their commitment, funds that could be combined to expand the farm operation. It was a brilliant scam. Men traveling to meet a potential bride wouldn't tell many people where they were going. They'd arrive alone, carrying their life savings, telling themselves they were investing in their future. Andrew Helgelian from Aberdeen, South Dakota, was typical of Belle's targets. A bachelor farmer in his late 40s, he'd saved diligently for years. When he received Belle's warm, encouraging letters, he saw his loneliness ending. In January 1908, he withdrew his savings and told his brother Assel he was traveling to Indiana to meet a woman he might marry. "If you don't hear from me, you'll know I've found happiness," Andrew said. It was the last time Assel would see his brother alive. John Moe arrived from Minnesota around the same time, another lonely bachelor clutching his life savings. Old Budberg came from Wisconsin, a widower seeking a new start. The pattern was always the same. Belle would send affectionate letters, encourage the men to visit, request they bring proof of their financial stability, and promise a future together. The men would arrive at the isolated farmhouse, often at night when the children were asleep, and then they would simply disappear. Neighbors occasionally asked Belle about the men they'd seen arriving at her farm. Her explanations were always plausible. They decided not to stay. They'd found work elsewhere. They'd returned home disappointed. Sometimes she claimed they'd left in the middle of the night after an argument. No one questioned her too closely. After all, Belle Gunness was a respected member of the community, a churchgoer, a mother, a woman who'd overcome tremendous hardship. The idea that she could be anything other than what she appeared was simply unthinkable. But someone was beginning to think the unthinkable. Assel Helgelian hadn't heard from his brother Andrew in months. The letters from Belle had stopped. His inquiries went unanswered. Something was very wrong at the farm on McClung Road, and Assel Helgelian was determined to find out what. He had no idea that his search for the truth would uncover one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. The Black Widow's web was about to be exposed, and the nation was about to learn that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like widows running pig farms. Sometimes they advertise in newspapers. And sometimes they bury their victims where the pigs can root. The letters Belle Gunness wrote were weapons disguised as affection. They arrived in lonely farmhouses across the Midwest, written in careful Norwegian script, promising companionship and prosperity to men who'd spent too many winters alone. "My dear friend," she would begin, her words warm as a hearth fire, "I have been thinking of you constantly since receiving your photograph. You have an honest face, the face of a man who understands hard work and family values." She knew exactly what these men wanted to hear. She'd made a study of loneliness, and she wielded it like a blade. Each letter followed a careful progression. First came the emotional connection, shared immigrant experiences, the challenges of building a life in America, the difficulty of finding someone who truly understood. Then came hints of prosperity, her successful farm, her livestock, her productive land. Finally, the hook. Wouldn't it be wonderful if two hard-working people could combine their resources and build something truly magnificent together? But Belle was careful to add one crucial requirement. Any serious suitor must demonstrate his financial stability by bringing liquid assets, cash, bonds, easily convertible wealth. She framed it as practicality. It was actually a death sentence. Old Budberg was a widower from Iola, Wisconsin, a man in his 50s who'd worked his entire life and saved with Norwegian frugality. When Belle's letters began arriving in late 1907, he read them to his son Oscar, his voice catching with hope. "She sounds like a good woman," Ole told his son. "Strong, capable, not like these American women who don't know how to work." Oscar watched his father transform from a grieving widower into a man planning a future. In January 1908, Ole withdrew his savings, packed a small trunk, and kissed his son goodbye. "I'll write as soon as I know whether this will work out," he promised. He never wrote. He never came home. He simply vanished into the Indiana darkness. John Moe and his friend Henry Gaholt traveled together from Minnesota, both bachelors who'd answered Belle's advertisement. They arrived at her farm in early 1908, their pockets heavy with cash, their hearts light with possibility. Neighbors saw them arrive. No one saw them leave. When Henry's brother inquired about their whereabouts weeks later, Belle sent a letter explaining that the men had left after only one night, disappointed that her farm wasn't as grand as they'd expected. "They were rude and ungrateful," she wrote, "and I was glad to see them go." The explanation satisfied Henry's brother temporarily, though something about the letter troubled him. Why would two men travel so far only to leave immediately? Why had neither man written home? The truth was horrifying in its simplicity. Belle would greet her suitors warmly, feed them a hearty dinner, perhaps offer them coffee or whiskey to warm them after their journey. She discussed plans for combining their resources, expanding the farm, building a future together. And then, when the moment was right, when they were relaxed, unsuspecting, possibly drowsy from the long journey and the heavy meal, she would strike. Sometimes she used chloroform to subdue them first. Sometimes she relied on her considerable physical strength and the element of surprise. A heavy blow to the head with a meat cleaver or an axe. A knife between the ribs. Quick, brutal, efficient. She perfected the disposal process through grim repetition. The bodies would be dismembered in her basement, the pieces wrapped in oilcloth and burlap. Under cover of darkness, Belle would haul the remains to various locations around her property, the hog pen, the garden, remote sections of the 48 acres where the soil was soft and the trees provided cover. She'd dig deep graves, sometimes filling them with quicklime to accelerate decomposition. Then she'd return to the farmhouse, wash the blood from her hands and clothes, and burn any evidence in the kitchen stove. By morning, she'd be feeding her children breakfast as if nothing had happened. Because for Belle, nothing had happened. This was simply business. Her handyman, Ray Lamphere, knew something was wrong. He worked for Belle on and off since 1906, a drifter with a drinking problem and an infatuation with his employer. Ray had seen the men arrive. He'd noticed they never left. He'd helped Belle with suspicious late-night digging projects, though she'd always explained them as routine farm work. New drainage ditches, fence post holes, repairs to the hog pen foundation. Ray wasn't bright, but he wasn't entirely stupid either. He suspected Belle was involved in something criminal, possibly theft or fraud. He had no idea the true scale of her crimes, and his knowledge, limited though it was, made him dangerous. By late 1907, Belle began preparing for the possibility that her operation might be discovered. She withdrew money from local banks and converted it to cash. She sent Jenny, Peter Gunness' daughter and the only witness to his suspicious death, away to a finishing school in California, or so she told neighbors. Jenny Gunness was never seen again. Most historians believe Belle murdered her stepdaughter to eliminate the one person who knew too much. The girl was likely buried somewhere on the property with the others. Belle also began a campaign to turn the community against Ray Lamphere. She told neighbors he'd become obsessed with her, that he was making unwanted advances, that she feared for her safety. In February 1908, she took out a restraining order against him and hired a new handyman to replace him. The message to Ray was clear. If anything happened to Belle or her property, he would be the prime suspect. It was insurance of a different kind, a way to deflect suspicion if her crimes were ever discovered. Belle was always thinking ahead, always planning, always aware that her empire of murder couldn't last forever. Andrew Helgillian arrived from Aberdeen, South Dakota, in January 1908, carrying between $3,000 and $4,000 in cash. His brother Assel had begged him to be careful, to wire home as soon as he arrived, to keep some of his money safely deposited rather than carrying it all. But Andrew was optimistic, even reckless in his hope. Belle's letters had painted such a vivid picture of their future together. He imagined children, prosperity, a partnership with a capable woman who understood hard work. He couldn't imagine he was walking into an abattoir. Belle greeted Andrew warmly, showed him around the farm, introduced him to her children. For a day or two, everything seemed perfect. Andrew likely believed he'd found exactly what he'd been searching for. Then, when the moment came, perhaps after dinner, perhaps in the barn while discussing livestock, perhaps in his bedroom at night, Belle ended his dreams with clinical efficiency. Another body to dismember, another grave to dig, another life insurance policy of sorts, except Belle collected in cash rather than through insurance companies. But this time, Belle had made a mistake. Andrew Helgelian had a brother who refused to accept silence as an answer. Assel Helgelian began writing letters to Belle, demanding to know where Andrew had gone. Belle responded initially, claiming Andrew had left after a brief visit, saying he'd decided to go to Norway. But Assel checked with steamship companies. No Andrew Helgelian had booked passage to Norway. Assel wrote to the Porte sheriff, expressing concerns about his brother's disappearance. The sheriff made preliminary inquiries, though he had no evidence of a crime. Belle Gunness was a respected property owner. Andrew Helgelian was an adult man who'd come and gone of his own free will. There was nothing the sheriff could do. Yet, Assel Helgelian began planning a trip to Porte to investigate personally. Belle sensed the walls closing in. She'd killed perhaps a dozen men, maybe more. She'd accumulated their wealth and buried their bodies across her property. But one persistent brother asking the wrong questions could unravel everything. Belle needed a solution, and Belle's solutions always involved death and fire. In April 1908, she met with her lawyer to update her will and discuss selling the farm. She told him she feared Ray Lamphere might try to harm her. She told her neighbors the same thing. She was building a narrative, creating a story that would explain what was about to happen. Because Belle Gunness had one final performance to give, one last disappearing act that would allow her to escape with her accumulated wealth, while everyone believed she'd died a victim. The stage was set. The final act was about to begin. And Porte, Indiana, was about to discover that the friendly widow on McClung Road had been hiding a secret darker than anyone had dared imagine. The night of April 27th, 1908, began like any other in Porte. Spring rain had softened the ground, and a steady wind whispered through the trees surrounding Belle Gunness' farmhouse. Inside, her 3 children, Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip, were sleeping in their beds. Or so the neighbors would later assume. By dawn, the Gunness farmhouse would be nothing but smoking ruins, and investigators would be facing a mystery that would haunt them for decades. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, flames erupted from the Gunness residence with shocking speed and intensity. The fire wasn't creeping or accidental. It was voracious, as if the house had been soaked in accelerant and waiting for a match. Neighbors saw the orange glow against the night sky and rushed toward the property. But by the time they arrived, the structure was already collapsing inward, timbers crashing down in showers of sparks. The heat was so intense that no one could get close enough to attempt a rescue. They could only stand and watch as the farmhouse was consumed, the flames reflected in their horrified faces. When the fire brigade finally arrived from town, there was little left to save. They poured water on the smoldering wreckage, but the house was lost. As dawn broke gray and cold over Porte, the grim work of searching the ruins began. What the investigators found in the basement would turn a local tragedy into a national sensation. For bodies, for charred corpses huddled together in the cellar as if they'd fled, they're seeking refuge from the flames. 3 were clearly children, their smaller forms recognizable despite the fire's destruction. The 4th was an adult, a woman, judging by the size and position. But something was immediately disturbingly wrong. The adult body was headless. The skull was simply missing, nowhere to be found in the debris despite a painstaking search of the ashes. Sheriff Albert Smutzer stood in the ruins that morning, staring at the decapitated corpse, and felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. This was no accident. Belle Gunness' lawyer had warned him just days earlier that she feared for her life, that Ray Lamphere had been making threats. And now Belle was dead, her children were dead, and Lamphere was nowhere to be found. The sheriff issued an arrest warrant immediately. By that evening, Ray Lamphere was in custody, charged with arson and murder. The town wanted to believe the case was solved. Ray Lamphere was a known drunk, a drifter, a man who'd been obsessed with Belle. He'd been fired from his position as her handyman, and witnesses had heard him muttering threats about what he'd do to that woman. The narrative was perfect, except for one problem: the missing head. Where was Belle Gunness' skull? Why would fire hot enough to char bodies to the bone somehow completely destroy only the head? And why, when the coroner examined the adult female corpse, did it seem smaller than Belle, a woman who'd stood nearly 6 feet tall and weighed close to 200 pounds? The coroner's initial assessment estimated the headless woman's weight at around 150 pounds. Too small to be Belle, unless the fire had somehow reduced her mass significantly. Some experts argued that intense heat could cause such shrinkage. Others pointed out that Belle's distinctive dental work, expensive gold crowns on several teeth, should have survived the fire. Find the skull, identify the dental work, and you'd have definitive proof. But the skull had vanished as if it had never existed. As investigators processed the fire scene, Asle Helgelian arrived in La Porte. His timing was darkly perfect. He'd traveled from South Dakota, still searching for his missing brother Andrew, and he arrived to find Belle Gunness' farm at the center of a murder investigation. Asle went directly to Sheriff Smutzer with his concerns about Andrew's disappearance. The sheriff listened with growing unease. Belle had corresponded with a missing man who'd come to her farm, carrying thousands of dollars in cash. And now she was conveniently dead in a fire that destroyed all evidence. Asle Helgelian made a simple request that would change everything. Let me dig on her property. Let me search for my brother. The sheriff agreed. On May 3rd, 1908, just 6 days after the fire, Asle Helgelian began excavating the Gunness property, starting with the areas near the hog pen where the soil looked disturbed. What he found in those first few hours would transform the investigation from a local arson case into one of the most sensational murder sprees in American history. The first grave was shallow, barely 3 feet deep. Asle's shovel struck something soft, wrapped in oilcloth. When they pulled the bundle from the earth and unwrapped it, the workers recoiled. Body parts, human remains, dismembered and partially decomposed. The torso was separate from the limbs. The head had been removed. This wasn't a burial. It was a disposal, the kind of methodical butchery you'd perform on livestock. Except this livestock had been human. Sheriff Smutzer immediately expanded the search. He brought in work crews and began systematic excavation of the entire 48-acre property, focusing on areas where the soil showed signs of disturbance. What they discovered over the next week defied comprehension. Grave after grave, body after body. Some were complete skeletons. Others were partial remains, dismembered and scattered. Some were wrapped carefully in oilcloth and burlap. Others were simply buried in the soft earth near the hog pen, where the pigs had helped dispose of the evidence by consuming soft tissue. The body count grew with horrifying speed. 5 bodies, 10 bodies, 15. The exact number became impossible to determine because some remains were incomplete, fragmented, or commingled. Investigators found at least 14 distinct victims, possibly more. Among them was Andrew Helgelian, identified by Asle through his brother's distinctive clothing and a watch Andrew had carried. Asle stood over his brother's remains and wept, vindicated in his suspicions but devastated by the confirmation. Other victims were identified through painstaking detective work. Old Budsberg, the Wisconsin widower. Jenny Gunness, Belle's stepdaughter, found buried in the hog pen. She'd never made it to that finishing school in California. John Moe, the Minnesota bachelor. The identifications came slowly, complicated by the fact that many victims were immigrant men who'd traveled alone, whose families might not even know they'd gone to Indiana. How many other lonely men lay in unmarked graves on the Gunness property, their disappearances never reported because no one knew to look for them? As investigators excavated, they also searched the ruins of the house more thoroughly. In the debris, they made a discovery that seemed to answer the question of the missing skull. Buried in the ashes of the cellar, they found teeth, several teeth with distinctive gold dental work that matched Belle Gunness' dental records. Her dentist was brought in to examine them and confirmed. These were Belle's teeth, or at least bridgework he'd created for her. The teeth had apparently been planted in the ashes, placed there deliberately. But by whom? And when? Two theories emerged, and they would divide investigators and the public for years to come. The first theory held that Belle Gunness had died in the fire, that Ray Lamphere had murdered her and her children in a jealous rage, and that the missing skull was simply an artifact of how bodies burn. The dental evidence supported this conclusion. Belle was dead, her children were dead, and the monster was gone. The second theory was far more disturbing. Belle Gunness had murdered an unknown woman, possibly a vagrant or drifter lured to the farm under false pretenses, and dressed the woman in her own clothing. She decapitated the victim to prevent identification, placed her own false teeth in the ashes to provide misleading evidence, then set the fire herself before escaping with the accumulated wealth from years of murders. In this version, Belle Gunness was still alive, somewhere in America, possibly still hunting. Ray Lamphere went to trial in November 1908, charged with murder and arson. The prosecution argued he'd set the fire that killed Belle and her children. The defense argued that Belle had set the fire herself and escaped. The jury couldn't decide on murder, but convicted him of arson. Lamphere was sentenced to prison, where he would die of tuberculosis less than 2 years later. But before he died, he made a confession to a fellow inmate, a confession that would add one final layer of mystery to the Belle Gunness story. According to Lamphere, Belle had indeed staged her own death. She'd murdered a woman she'd lured to the farm, decapitated her, dressed her in Belle's clothing, then killed her own 3 children, her own children, because they were witnesses who couldn't be trusted. She'd set the fire, paid Lamphere to help her escape, and fled with a fortune in cash. Lamphere claimed he'd helped her stage the scene, but hadn't killed anyone. He said Belle was alive and probably wealthy, living somewhere under a new identity. Was Lamphere telling the truth? Or was he a murderer, trying to deflect blame onto his dead employer? The authorities never found Belle Gunness. No confirmed sighting ever surfaced. Bank records showed she'd withdrawn thousands of dollars in the weeks before the fire, but that money was never recovered. If she died in the fire, where was the money? If she'd escaped, why had no one ever found her? The fire at the Gunness farm had answered some questions while raising far more. At least 14 people were dead, possibly more. An American community had harbored a serial killer for years without suspecting. And the question that would haunt La Porte for generations remained unanswered. Was the Black Widow dead, or was she out there somewhere, perhaps already planning her next kill? The flames had consumed the evidence, but they'd exposed the truth. And that truth was more horrible than anyone had imagined. The excavation of Belle Gunness property became a macabre spectacle that drew thousands of curiosity seekers from across the Midwest. By mid-May 1908, the Gunness farm had transformed into something between a crime scene and a carnival. Special trains ran from Chicago, bringing reporters, photographers, and morbid tourists who paid local boys a nickel for tours of the murder farm. They stood behind police cordons, watching as investigators methodically turned Belle's pastoral acreage into an archaeological dig of death. The work was grim and methodical. Sheriff Smutzer organized his men into search teams, each assigned specific sections of the property. They probed the ground with steel rods, feeling for the soft spots that might indicate disturbed earth. When they found suspicious areas, they dug carefully, treating each potential gravesite as evidence that might reveal not just who had died, but how Belle Gunness had operated her killing machine. What emerged from those excavations was a portrait of a woman who'd turned murder into a systematic enterprise. The graves near the hog pen yielded the most victims. The location was strategic. Belle had chosen an area where she regularly worked, where digging wouldn't seem unusual, where the pigs could assist in disposing of remains. The hogs had been particularly effective at consuming soft tissue, leaving primarily bones and the clothing that had wrapped them. One investigator noted grimly that Belle had essentially created a biological disposal system, using her livestock as accomplices in erasing evidence. But it wasn't just the number of bodies that shocked investigators. It was the evidence of premeditation in how Belle had buried them. Many victims showed signs of having been dismembered with professional efficiency. Limbs had been separated at the joints, not hacked randomly. Heads had been removed cleanly. The bodies had been drained of blood, likely in her basement, before being wrapped in layers of oilcloth, burlap, and sometimes sections of rubber matting. Belle had developed a system, refined through repetition, for reducing human beings to manageable parcels that could be buried without detection. Dr. Walter Haynes, a toxicology expert from Chicago, arrived to examine the remains for evidence of poisoning. His analysis of tissue samples from several victims revealed traces of strychnine and arsenic, though the advanced decomposition made definitive conclusions difficult. Belle, it appeared, had used multiple methods. Some victims had been poisoned, their suffering prolonged as the toxins ravaged their systems. Others had been killed quickly with blunt force trauma, skulls crushed by heavy instruments, probably the same meat cleaver or axe Belle used for farm work. A few showed evidence of having been struck from behind, suggesting they'd never seen death coming. The basement of the burned farmhouse yielded particularly disturbing evidence. Even after the fire, investigators found distinctive stains on the concrete floor, iron-rich discolorations consistent with large quantities of blood. They found drainage channels Belle had apparently carved into the concrete, allowing blood to flow toward a central collection point. They found hooks mounted in the ceiling beams, the kind a butcher might use to hang carcasses. Belle hadn't just killed on her property. She'd created an infrastructure for killing, a processing facility designed to efficiently transform living men into buried remains. As the body count mounted, investigators attempted to identify every victim. Some were easy. Andrew Julian had been carrying identifying documents and the pocket watch his brother recognized. Old Budberg was identified through his clothing and a distinctive scar on his leg that his son described. But many victims remained nameless, known only by their approximate age, height, and the clothing they'd worn to their deaths. These unknown men represented the true tragedy of Belle's operation. Immigrants who'd traveled alone, whose absence had never been reported, whose families might still be waiting for letters that would never come. The investigators discovered Belle's correspondence files in a fireproof safe that had survived the blaze. Inside were dozens of letters from prospective suitors, each one responding to her matrimonial advertisements. The letters revealed Belle's victim selection process with chilling clarity. She'd only pursued men who mentioned having substantial savings. When a respondent wrote that he was comfortable but not wealthy, Belle would send a polite rejection. When a man wrote that he'd saved $5,000 and owned property free and clear, Belle's responses became warm and encouraging, pressing him to visit soon and bring proof of his assets. One particularly heartbreaking letter came from a man named Olaf Lindblom, who'd written to Belle in broken English. "I am not handsome, man, but I am honest and hardworking. I have saved $900, which is everything I own in this world. If you will have me, I will give you all of it and work every day to make you happy." Belle had written back with unusual enthusiasm. Olaf Lindblom was never heard from again. His remains were likely among the unidentified victims found on the property. The financial investigation revealed the scale of Belle's operation. Detectives traced bank deposits, property records, and purchases over the 7 years Belle had operated from the Porte farm. Conservative estimates suggested she'd accumulated between $30,000 and $40,000 from her victims, a staggering fortune in 1908, equivalent to well over $1 million today. Much of this money had been withdrawn in the weeks before the fire, converted to cash and bonds that Belle could easily transport. If she'd died in the fire, this fortune had vanished with her. If she'd escaped, she'd left as a wealthy woman. As excavations continued through May and into June, the daily discoveries became routine horrors. Workers found a watch here, a pair of eyeglasses there, fragments of clothing, shoes, personal effects that had once belonged to living men with dreams and futures. Each artifact told a story of hope betrayed, of loneliness exploited, of a predator who'd understood exactly how to identify and isolate vulnerable prey. The Norwegian immigrant community, in particular, was devastated. Belle had targeted her own people, used their language and shared cultural background to build trust, then murdered them for profit. The question that haunted everyone was simple. How had she gotten away with it for so long? Porte wasn't a large city, where people could disappear unnoticed. It was a small town where everyone knew their neighbors. Yet Belle had been murdering men regularly since at least 1902, possibly earlier, and no one had suspected. The answer lay in Belle's careful victim selection and manipulation of social expectations. She'd chosen men who were traveling alone, who hadn't told many people where they were going, whose absence might not be immediately noticed. She'd exploited the immigrant experience, men seeking new starts who'd left their old lives behind, who were expected to disappear and reinvent themselves in America. Belle had also weaponized gender expectations. As a woman, particularly a widow, she was perceived as vulnerable rather than threatening. When she explained that suitors had left in the night after arguments, or that they decided to seek opportunities elsewhere, people believed her. The idea that a woman, a mother, a churchgoer, a property owner, could be a serial killer was literally unthinkable to the residents of La Porte. Belle had hidden in plain sight, protected by the assumption that women weren't capable of such systematic violence. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The excavation officially ended in late June 1908, though speculation persisted that more bodies remained undiscovered. The official count stood at 14 confirmed victims, with strong evidence suggesting there were more. Some investigators believe the true number might be as high as 40, spanning Belle's entire criminal career from Chicago to La Porte. The bodies were buried in La Porte's cemetery, many in unmarked graves because no one knew their names. They rest there still, anonymous victims of America's most prolific female serial killer. The Gunness property became infamous, a destination for dark tourism that continued for years. The farmhouse was never rebuilt. The land was eventually sold, subdivided, and developed. But locals still spoke in hushed tones about the murder farm, about the black widow who'd turned romance into a death sentence, about the graveyard hidden beneath what had appeared to be productive farmland. Children were warned to stay away from the old Gunness property, as if evil might somehow still linger in the soil where so many had been buried. What investigators had uncovered wasn't just a series of murders. It was evidence of a criminal mind that had operated with businesslike efficiency for years, perhaps decades. Belle Gunness had seen murder as a revenue stream, a way to accumulate wealth without the tedious constraints of legitimate work. She'd industrialized killing, treating human beings as resources to be harvested, and she'd nearly gotten away with it entirely. But one question still remained, haunting the investigators who'd excavated her property, tormenting the families of her victims, fascinating a nation hungry for answers. Was Belle Gunness among the dead, or was she out there somewhere, counting her blood money and planning her next identity? The graveyard beneath had yielded its secrets. But the biggest secret of all, whether the Black Widow still lived, remained locked in mystery. The excavation was over. The bodies were buried. But the story of Belle Gunness was far from finished. The headless corpse found in the ashes of Belle Gunness farmhouse became the most controversial piece of evidence in American criminal history. Everything hinged on that body's identity. If it was Belle, then justice had been served by fire, and the Black Widow's reign of terror had ended on April 28, 1908. If it wasn't Belle, then somewhere in America walked a woman who'd murdered at least 14 people, possibly dozens more, and escaped with a fortune built on betrayal and blood. The debate began immediately and has never truly ended. Dr. J.P. Meyer, the La Porte physician who performed the initial examination, faced an impossible task. The body had been severely burned, the flesh charred and contracted by intense heat. Without a head, without distinctive features, he had to rely on measurements and comparative analysis. The corpse measured approximately 5 feet 3 inches in length. Belle Gunness, by all accounts, had stood 5 feet 7 to 5 feet 9 inches tall. The weight discrepancy was even more pronounced. The body weighed roughly 150 pounds, while Belle had been a powerfully built woman who'd weighed between 200 and 210 pounds. Dr. Meyer acknowledged these discrepancies, but argued they could be explained by fire's effects on human tissue. Extreme heat causes muscles to contract violently, drawing limbs inward and potentially reducing a body's apparent length. Fat tissue liquefies and burns away, drastically reducing weight. The counterargument came from other medical experts who pointed out that while some shrinkage was normal, the magnitude of difference between the corpse and Belle's known dimensions was simply too great. A 5'9" woman doesn't contract to 5'3", even the most intense fire. And 200 pounds doesn't reduce to 150 unless the body has been burning for hours, which this house fire demonstrably had not. Then there were the teeth. 4 teeth and a partial bridge bearing distinctive gold dental work were found in the debris, carefully examined by Dr. Ira P. Norton, Belle's dentist. Dr. Norton confirmed these were dental prosthetics he'd created for Belle several years earlier. This should have been definitive proof. Dental evidence is notoriously reliable because teeth survive conditions that destroy other tissue. But the circumstances of the discovery troubled skeptics. The teeth hadn't been found in or near the skull because there was no skull. They'd been found scattered in the ashes, as if they'd been placed there rather than naturally detached during the fire. Dr. Norton himself admitted under questioning that the dental work could have been removed while Belle was alive and planted as false evidence. The missing skull haunted the investigation. In virtually every structure fire involving fatalities, skulls survive. They may be damaged, cracked, or fragmented, but they don't simply vanish. Yet despite exhaustive searches of the ash and debris, no trace of the adult victim's skull was ever found. The 3 children's skulls were recovered, charred but intact. Why would fire totally destroy one skull while leaving others in the same location? The most plausible explanation was that the adult victim had been decapitated before the fire, the head removed and disposed of elsewhere to prevent identification. Louis Schultz, an attorney representing Assel Helgelian and several other victims' families, became convinced that Belle had escaped. He hired private investigators to track potential sightings and interviewed Ray Lamphere extensively before the handyman's death in 1909. Lamphere's deathbed confession, delivered to fellow inmate Harry Myers, provided a detailed account of Belle's escape plan. According to Lamphere, Belle had lured a woman to the farm, possibly a prostitute or transient, in the days before the fire. She'd murdered this woman, dressed her in her own clothing, decapitated her, and arranged her body with the 3 children in the basement. She'd killed her own children, Lamphere claimed, because they were too young to reliably keep secrets but old enough to eventually talk about what they'd seen. Lamphere said Belle had paid him $500 to help stage the scene and start the fire, though he insisted he hadn't participated in any murders. He claimed Belle had drugged the children first, so they died from smoke inhalation without waking, making their deaths merciful in her twisted logic. After setting the fire, Belle had walked away from the burning farmhouse, carrying a suitcase packed with cash and bonds, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Lamphere said he was supposed to meet her later to collect additional payment, but she'd never appeared at their arranged meeting point. He assumed she'd simply betrayed him one final time. Was Lamphere telling the truth? He was a convicted arsonist with every reason to deflect blame onto the woman who'd employed him. Yet elements of his story aligned with physical evidence. Large sums of money that should have been on the property were never found. Belle had systematically closed bank accounts and converted assets to portable wealth in the weeks before the fire. She'd settled debts, updated her will, and made arrangements that suggested someone planning to disappear rather than someone planning to die. If she'd intended to perish in the fire, why liquidate her assets? In the years following the fire, alleged sightings of Belle Gunness erupted across America like wildfire rumors. She was spotted in Chicago, in San Francisco, in New York, and New Orleans. A woman matching her description was seen boarding a train in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the day after the fire. Another witness claimed to have seen her working in a bakery in Los Angeles in 1910. A Norwegian immigrant insisted he'd encountered her in Minneapolis in 1911, calling herself by a different name but unmistakably Belle. The same height, the same powerful build, the same cold blue eyes. None of these sightings were ever confirmed. None led to an arrest. The most compelling potential identification came in 1931, more than 20 years after the fire. A woman named Esther Carlson was arrested in Los Angeles for poisoning a man she'd been caring for, allegedly to collect an inheritance. Photographs of Carlson bore a striking resemblance to Belle Gunness. The same facial structure, similar build, approximate age. Carlson had arrived in Los Angeles around 1908 with no clear history before that date. She'd worked as a private nurse and housekeeper, positions that gave her access to vulnerable, often elderly men living alone. At least two of her previous employers had died under suspicious circumstances, their deaths attributed to natural causes at the time, but now viewed with suspicion. Authorities contacted Ray Lamphere's attorney and several people who'd known Belle, showing them photographs of Esther Carlson. Some were certain it was Belle. Others were equally certain it wasn't. The comparison was complicated by age. If Carlson was Belle, she was now in her 70s, dramatically changed by 2 decades. Before she could be formally questioned about the La Porte murders, Esther Carlson died in prison while awaiting trial. She took her secrets, whatever they were, to the grave. No definitive evidence linked her to Belle Gunness beyond superficial resemblance and suspicious behavior patterns. The debate over the fire victim's identity became a touchstone for discussions about forensic science, criminal psychology, and the nature of justice. The conservative, official position held that Belle had died in the fire. Case closed, monster dead, town safe. The skeptical position insisted Belle had escaped, that she'd been too intelligent and too careful to die in such a clumsy manner, that somewhere she'd lived out her days wealthy and unpunished. Both positions had evidence. Neither had proof. What everyone could agree on was Belle Gunness' legacy of destruction. At minimum, 14 confirmed victims. Realistically, probably 20 to 30. Possibly more than 40 if you included her husband's, her children from her first marriage, and unidentified victims from her Chicago years. She'd preyed on the vulnerable, exploited the lonely, and turned the immigrant dream into a nightmare. She'd operated with impunity for years, protected by gender assumptions and careful victim selection. And whether she died in the flames or escaped to kill again, her crimes had revealed uncomfortable truths about American society. Belle had succeeded because her victims were disposable in the eyes of society. Immigrant bachelors and widowers, men without extensive family networks or community ties, could disappear without generating much investigation. The police hadn't taken Assel Helgilian seriously when he first reported his brother missing. Local authorities had accepted Belle's explanations for years because she was a respectable property owner and a woman. The system had failed Belle's victims long before they arrived at her farm. The psychological profile that emerged from studying Belle's crimes was chilling in its implications. She exhibited no remorse, no emotional connection to her victims, no hesitation about killing her own children if they threatened her plans. Modern criminal psychologists would likely diagnose her as a psychopath, someone incapable of empathy, driven entirely by self-interest, able to mimic normal human emotions without actually feeling them. She'd use her understanding of human psychology to manipulate victims, appearing warm and maternal while calculating the most efficient way to kill them. What made Belle truly terrifying wasn't just that she killed. It was how systematically she killed. She'd industrialized murder, treating it as a business proposition with acceptable risk levels and profit margins. She'd kept meticulous financial records while destroying lives. She'd maintained a public persona as a struggling widow while operating a killing ground in her basement. The disconnect between her public and private selves was absolute, suggesting a level of psychological compartmentalization that made her exceptionally dangerous. In the decades after her apparent death, La Porte struggled with its dark history. The Gunness property became synonymous with horror, a destination for curious tourists, but a source of shame for locals. Children grew up hearing stories about the Black Widow, turning Belle into a boogeyman figure parents used to frighten misbehaving kids. Be good, or Belle Gunness will get you. The town tried to move past the murders, to focus on other aspects of its history, but the shadow of those 48 acres lingered. What's your take on this case? Did Belle Gunness die in the fire on April 28, 1908, her reign of terror ended by flames? Or did she walk away from the burning farmhouse, carrying the wealth she'd accumulated through 14 confirmed murders, to live out her days unpunished and unknown? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The truth, most likely, lies buried with Belle herself. Whether in the cemetery at La Porte beneath a headstone marking an unknown woman, or in some unmarked grave far from Indiana where an elderly woman died decades ago, taking the secret of her true identity to oblivion. The victims deserve for the truth to be known. The families who waited for letters that never came deserve closure. But justice, in the case of Belle Gunness, remains as elusive as the woman herself. The Black Widow of La Porte left behind a legacy written in blood and buried bones. She revealed how easily monsters can hide among us, protected by our assumptions about gender, respectability, and human nature. She demonstrated that serial killers aren't always the obvious outcasts. Sometimes they're the pillars of the community, the hardworking widow next door, the woman who bakes pies and goes to church and buries bodies between shores. More than a century has passed since the Gunness farmhouse burned. The exact body count remains unknown. The fate of Belle herself remains uncertain. But her crimes endure as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it advertises in newspapers. Sometimes it writes love letters. Sometimes it invites lonely men to a farm in Indiana and promises them a future they'll never live to see. The mystery of Belle Gunness may never be fully solved, but her story will continue to fascinate, horrify, and haunt us, a testament to humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty and the uncomfortable truth that some killers are never truly caught. They simply vanish into history, leaving behind graveyards and questions that echo across generations. The clock stopped ticking for Belle's victims the moment they arrived at her farm. But the timer on the mystery of her fate continues to run, counting down toward an answer that may never come. Justice, like truth, sometimes remains forever just out of reach, a ghost haunting the ruins of what was once called the murder farm of La Porte. The story of Belle Gunness, the Black Widow who may have escaped justice, the serial killer who turned matrimonial advertisements into death sentences, the woman who revealed that monsters don't always look like monsters, remains one of America's most chilling unsolved mysteries.